National publications. Her most recent book, Troffitt's, puts together history, ecology, and personalities to tell the compelling story of U.S. conservation, which is on our mind of late quite a bit. Carolyn Finney, PhD, is a writer, performer, and cultural geographer. She is a professor in geography at the University of Kentucky and is deeply interested in issues related to identity, difference, creativity, and resilience. She serves on the U.S. National Parks Advisory Board that is working to assist the National Park Service in engaging with diverse communities. She is also part of a Centennial Initiative, a first-of-its-kind coalition of civil rights, environmental justice, conservation, and community leaders from around the country. Her first book, Black Faces, White Spaces, Reimagining the Relationship of African Americans to the Great Outdoors, was released in 2014. So let's give them a warm welcome. I'd like to open it up just by asking how you both came to this. Where did your love and inspiration and passion arise from, and where are you now with that?
Carolyn's been talking all day, so maybe I'll start. Not that we don't want to hear more, but we've had several. Right. I'll keep it brief. I really probably started the reporting for this book about 30 years ago as a junior ranger on Cape Cod National Seashore. And at the end of long days on the beach, sunburnt and sea sprayed, my sister and I, who's here today, we would go collect driftwood for campfires. And we'd sit around those campfires while park rangers told us stories about pirates and stars and shipwrecks. And it was a magical thing. And I think now that I've been to about 170 national park units out of over 400, so it's not as impressive as it sounds. But I think every time I go to one, I look for a little bit more of that alchemy, that sense that there really are discoveries around every corner. So that's one motivation. The other one, which hopefully we'll talk a little bit more about, is I'm kind of on a constant quest to tell some of the untold stories about obvious topics, and the Centennial is a huge one this year. And what I really took a lot of time to try to do in the book was to illuminate, to augment some of those lesser known narratives. I think we look in mirrors when we look at certain topics and certain people, and we try to see ourselves. And honestly, when I started researching this book, I didn't see anybody entirely like myself, but I knew there must be. So I spent a lot of time looking for contributions women had made, contributions African Americans had made, Native Americans, Latinos, to the conservation story of the U.S., as well as to the story of national parks and the Park Service. And there are those stories, which I was excited to find and be able to tell, but that was a long-winded intro. So somewhere in the middle there, this was the result.
Okay, well, so I'm an accidental national parks person. People are always saying, oh, you write about national parks. Actually, I don't. So about 2000, I've told this story a lot, but it's really the only way for me to get there is I grew up in New York. My parents they grew up in a little town called Floyd, Virginia. They were poor, black, high school educated. My father went and fought in the Korean War, so this was in the 50s when he came back from the war, like a lot of black folks in the South, decided to move north, thought he'd have a better opportunity at getting a job. So they moved up to New York. My father got 2 job offers. The first was he could be a janitor in Syracuse, New York, which is about 5 hours north of New York City. The other was 30 minutes outside of New York City in Westchester County, a very wealthy Jewish family called the Tishmans. They have a building. They own the Rockefeller Center, a lot of real estate in New York City. Had a 12-acre estate, 30 minutes outside of the city, lake, swimming pool, vegetable gardens, fruit trees, beautiful, stunning piece of property. They needed people to be on that property full-time, caretaker, chauffeur, housekeeper, and my parents took that job. Normally, if I was doing this, I'd show you pictures because the estate is really quite stunning. It's in a very wealthy white neighborhood. Harry Winston has property down the street. Wingfoot Golf Club is around the corner. Schaefer of Schaefer Beer used to live next door, but I always tell people Schaefer Beer isn't very good. My parents were the only, well, let me skip. So they wanted to have kids. They thought they couldn't have kids. They adopted me, and then what I always say is they relaxed, had my first brother, then I had my second brother. We were the only family of color in this neighborhood until the 1990s when a Japanese-American woman moved in. She has since moved out. The Tishmans only came up on weekends and holidays, so my brothers and I had full run. It was like being in your own park. Right, so this is sort of my experience of non-human nature is that we played outside all the time, and it was beautiful because there were woods and wildlife, and nobody else was allowed to play on it. Woo, you know, it was like ours, except it wasn't. I like to tell the story that when I was 9 years old, I was walking home from school. I had my little afro, my little school bag. I was highly unimpressive. And because there was a lot of wealth in this neighborhood, there were always policemen patrolling this neighborhood. A policeman stopped me. He asked me, he said, well, so where are you going? And I said, 1000 Old White Plains Road, which is the address. And he said, oh, do you work there? And I'm thinking, I'm 9. And I went home and told my father, who called up the police station, gave him holy hell, and they never bothered us again. But I think at that moment, the idea of my skin color and being in this beautiful, natural environment was unnatural. The idea that the policeman could look at me and see a 9-year-old girl with a school bag walking home from school at 3:30, the logical thing in my mind would be that obviously she must be going home, but he couldn't imagine that I would have the right to be there or could afford to be there, except I must have been working to be there. So my ideas of who is allowed to be in nature, how we define nature, how we're supposed to interact with nature, I think started to get shaped at that place. But at the same time, I was having this amazing experience every day outside in the space. I want to jump ahead a little bit to 2003, because that's when I started thinking about this work as a dissertation. I had gone back to school to do it, and what was happening with my family. So Mr. Tishman had died a long time ago, and I always say, I call him Mr. and Mrs. Tishman. That needs some wine and a therapist's couch. But Mrs. Tishman in the 90s knew that she was dying and what was going to happen to my parents who'd been on this land all that time. And the Tishmans would only come up on weekends and holidays, right? And to her credit, she tried to keep my parents on this land, this idea, and it was very difficult to do because there was the gardener's cottage, which is quite beautiful, and what I call the big house where the Tishmans would come up to. At that time, in the mid-90s, that property was worth over $3 million a year. The property taxes were $125,000. I mean, $3 million was the price of the property. $125,000 a year was the property taxes alone. My dad had been making about $20,000 a year. And in the end, even though she was willing to pay those property taxes in perpetuity, because they had a very tight relationship, and what I always say to people is like Morgan Freeman and Driving Miss Daisy, except I never say that to my father. But Mrs. Tishman had my father by her bedside when she was dying. So, I mean, it was a complicated relationship. In the end, it wasn't going to work out for multiple reasons, so she had a house built for them back in Virginia, in Leesburg, Virginia, which is near D.C. Then my father swore he would never go back to the state of Virginia. And she died. My parents stayed on until 2003. A new owner came in, and then they finally moved out. When my parents moved, it was at that moment, because especially my father got incredibly depressed about leaving land that they had cared for and loved for almost 50 years. And I started thinking about questions of ownership in this country around land. Because, you know, we talk about nature, but we're in large part talking about land, right? And who has ownership over it, and whose ownership counts. My parents would never call themselves environmentalists. Every day of their life, they were engaged with that property. They could tell you everything, without any degrees, about the trees and why they got fungus on the lakes and how the wildlife was changing over time. They had a really strong relationship with it, right? They didn't write about it, but they just lived it day to day. But their story is largely invisible, right? In the larger story, I think, in this country, we think about national parks and nature and again, whose ownership counts. So that was my motivation. It was really personal more than anything else, to tell that story. And then I started thinking about all the African Americans, you know, in the history of our country whose stories we never hear. And it's always this idea that black people don't camp, hike, fish, go on down the line. And it's like, well, we do everything like everybody else does. And then I went even beyond African Americans to think of all the stories in this country about nature, the environment, land, love, commitment, belonging, that we have never heard about, that's never part of the larger conservation story. So that's why I'm here.
That's a good reason. Thank you. There's so much I want to talk about, and some had to do with this ownership and idea of who do we label environmentalists, and often the people who are privileged to be labeled environmentalists are labeled environmentalists. So I want to go back to that, but I'd like to start with a broad look at national parks and what do you perceive they are and what they do for this country. I mean, I just want to touch briefly in with the biggest thing we're talking about here, which is public lands for us all, and how you see that, as important in today's world or where it might be going. So let's just quickly talk about that.
Yeah, I'm happy to address that, but I wanted to say first, hopefully we can get back to the huge gulf in between, and we start out talking about how we arrive at our love for nature and the environment. And the contrast is so great between the two of us that I want to talk about that in terms of the crisis of relevancy in parks today and how that's one of the biggest problems we face in conservation. How I came at them, which is kind of the dominant paradigm, and how you came at them, which needs to be, the dominant paradigm in part going forward if we want to maintain the parks that we know today. So hopefully we can return to that. Your question was about the importance of parks. Over 400, 413 maybe at last count, national park units. Everybody knows Yellowstone, Yosemite, Glacier, and those, Rocky Mountain National Park in our backyard. Lesser known are the cultural and historical parks. Those, I think, play a big role. If we talk about the ecological side, hugely important in terms of preservation of those landscapes and refuges for endless numbers of species. But we also have parks like the Statue of Liberty and MLK Jr. and the Lincoln Memorial, all part of the Park Service. The one place Nelson Mandela wanted to go first when he came to this country was the Liberty Bell. Symbols like that are so important, places where history happened, where we can connect with that when we're there. So I want to talk about ecology, but I also want to talk about how important it is in this election year in particular, that when we talked a little bit about this yesterday, but we talk about police shootings or Supreme Court nominees, things like that, and we have to be able to look back if we're going to be able to look forward. And I think that's one of the main ways that parks need to stay to people today, and they really do tell the story of a lot of different types of people who have contributed to the history of this country. If you're talking about Cesar Chavez or Charles Young, the Buffalo Soldiers National Monument, which is one of the newest ones. There are parks dedicated to the Sand Creek Massacre, which we have in Colorado, all really important parts of that narrative of America. I think the Park Service is getting better now at not just not telling the white male stories and telling some of those other narratives, but they're actually eliciting those narratives from the people who actually are connected to that history. So that's a long road, I think, still, but that is starting to happen. So I think in many ways, different types of parks are relevant and important today.
I want to say that 2007, 2008, the Park Service was concerned about its own relevancy. So they created something called the Second Century Commission. And at that time, because of I had been working on that dissertation, and I talked about national parks only because they're supposed to represent an American identity. And I really wanted to challenge that, like what identity are we talking about again, whose stories are not part of that larger story. So they asked me to serve in the commission, which was a great privilege and a major learning curve, because there were people like Sandra Day O'Connor and Sally Jewell and the head of National Geographic, just people with extensive experience at thinking about this. And really, I'm just going to be honest with you, I understood the reason why I was there, because it was really about diversity. I mean, I got it. And I said, that's the platform. I said, this is kind of an odd platform, but okay, I'm going to go for it. And we spent a year, about 15 of us, 5 different 3-day retreats to talk about how can the Park Service retain its relevancy, how can the parks retain their relevancy. They came up with a number of things at the end of that year, education in parks, bringing science back to parks, the idea of really emphasizing philanthropy, looking at the history and what stories that need to be told there, and also connecting people to parks, which was their way of saying diversity. diversity and relevancy. And then after that, a bunch of us were asked to serve on the National Parks Advisory Board, which I've been doing now for about 8 years. So to the Park Service's credit, it was all new to me. It is a federal agency. I want all of us just to take a moment to remember that we're talking about a federal agency. Try moving a federal agency to do something different. Oh.
I like to say it's like turning around an aircraft carrier.
Yeah,
like,
or the Titanic.
Keep going,
yeah, exactly.
keep going.
But you've got some amazing people within the Park Service who understand the importance of this and are doing the work. Sometimes they have to do it under the radar with all those different units, right? So that means you've got different units in different parts of this country with different needs. Some of them are the Yosemites, and some of them are the Martin Luther King Jr.'s. They have different needs. They have different communities. They have different desires, because let's get real. If you get a superintendent who's down with some of these issues, he or she is just going to push that thing forward. And you can have another superintendent who really is just interested in the biological surroundings of the park. They got into this because they're interested in biological diversity, not in human diversity, right? So you have these complications in there, which is part of the reason it's difficult. For the Park Service, by their own admission, the diversity piece, which they call the relevancy piece, is one of the hardest pieces to move forward. Because how do you change the consciousness of a people? How do you engage and build relationships with others that are different from you? It is not just about getting visitors to come to the park. It's about who is actually working at the park, right? Which will inform also what stories get told. Park rangers are some of the best storytellers I have ever experienced. Have you ever gone and they don't even have any notes? Like, they're walking around, they remember all this stuff. I've just been blown away. I've seen more parks now because of my involvement. I never think about going to the national parks. I've hiked in other parts of the world. I'll always go to the other part of the world first. It's only in the last 10 years of my life that I have a sense of what's here. And I've had to work through some of my own personal difficulties with what that means. So I think that the park, I'm conflicted about it because I really want to support the good work that I see some really good people doing, but I'm entirely frustrated with the, if I'm kind, the sort of slowness because it's so big and awkward and bureaucratic. If I'm not kind, just the resistance, because there is also resistance. There's resistance to change. The Park Service was built on a military model, and I mean no disrespect to the military, and there's something very rigid about that. And it becomes difficult to actually change that kind of linear progression of that hierarchy. How do we think differently about what the Park Service can be and our public lands in general? The last thing I want to say, but I won't say any more, but somebody can ask me about it later, is this Next 100 coalition. Because, see, we're trying to get the president to issue a presidential memorandum about diversity and public lands agencies across the board. And this is something that's been happening about the last 6 months. So it's been this concerted effort supported by, actually, the organization is from Colorado. They like to stay behind the scenes. They have been absolutely incredible. But anyway, I'll leave that alone.
Good. I hope we go back to that because I want to hear more.
I just realized that they were from here, yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, can we go back to your original idea of talking more about that crisis of relevancy and the different ways that you approached that, or came to this?
Yeah, thanks. One of the reasons I was so excited to sit down with you in conversation about it is because I'll put my reporter cap on now, but to ask you questions about the conflicting information that I get in terms of visitation numbers. If you look at park numbers, follow more or less the demographics of the country, but way fewer minorities, way fewer Latinos, not reflective of the demographics in terms of that. But then we see statistics from, particularly outdoor research industry, those types of folks who talk about how Latinos spend way more on average per year on outdoor gear than your average outdoor enthusiast, whoever they imagine that is. So what is the disconnect here? Latinos are polled to care about the environment. They want to vote for people who seem to give a crap about it. So it seems like we're beginning to approach something. How can we keep that ball rolling, and how can we bring those two pieces together? Because minorities, who soon will not be minorities, they'll be the majority in this country, they can lead the narrative historically in terms of conservation. I've found that out. I've read hundreds and hundreds of pages of congressional hearings in order to write this book, and there are people whose stories we don't hear as much, and the ways they contribute to the history of America is the same. But how do we weave that thread into the present in terms of having those folks who clearly are outdoors and care reflected in the people who we see, particularly in national parks, but we could be talking about national forests or Chautauqua up the hill. So what's the disconnect?
Well, there's a lot of things, but I think. But the first is that for some reason, my experience has been in this country when we talk about the environment, nature, parks, it always seems to be something that's talked about in a vacuum. So all the other social and cultural issues that we have take place everywhere else, but not out in nature. And first I want to say, and that ain't true. Okay, so when John Muir and President Roosevelt were standing on overhanging rock in Yosemite in 1903, and they were talking about this really kind of brilliant idea, right? I don't want to diminish their idea, but they were kind of talking about it in a vacuum, because I doubt they were talking about Jim Crow segregation, and I doubt they were considering the rights of Native people who were living on that land before. This makes it complicated, right? It's complicated. When I think about in 1964, we had two of our most powerful pieces of legislation, right? The Civil Rights Act, which is the one that I remember, and the I just drew the Wilderness Act. That's what happens, right? I just drew a blank, which I only started thinking about in the last 10 years. They were happening in the same year. But these two groups of people were not talking to each other. I mean, they were both doing committed, hard work on these two separate ideas. The idea you could talk about a Wilderness Act where, we the people are going to have this kind of access and have the right to go to these spaces and do what we need to do, but yet we don't even have equal rights among men and women, people of different colors and classes. I mean, it's so interesting. How do we think we can get that over here if we're not talking about that over there as well? I think that's what's happening today. So there was a study a couple of summers ago called the Green 2.0 study put out by Dr. Dresita Taylor and some folks at the University of Michigan who looked at leadership in green environmental agencies, environmental organizations, and said the leadership still looks pretty much the same. And there's, this isn't for me about pitting white against black or brown. For me, that's not even a useful conversation. But if you have any kind of leadership that is largely homogenous in their experience and their understanding and their perception, it's going to be really hard for that group to actually address a much more diverse and complex society, right? So how do we build better relationships? How do we build better relationships and get to know who each other are? How do we get to know each other's story? So the disconnect is also for me buried in that, it's not really buried, all you gotta do is turn on the TV, is our lack of understanding, our mistrust of what we think we know, stereotypes. I just wrote a piece a couple of weeks ago in Outside Magazine. Now, I used to get Outside Magazine myself for years, and back in the day when I used to really go hiking all the time and everything. And I looked at 10 years worth of Outside Magazine because I really wanted to count who we were actually seeing when they talk about outdoors, right? 10 years worth of that. I came up with something like 4,600 pictures of people. Out of 4,600 pictures of people, only about 102 of them were African Americans, and almost all of them were famous male black sports figures in urban settings. It was very particular, right? The idea that, well, if we see black people, they're going to be famous, black male sports figures, and they're playing basketball in a city. Like, that's the only way that we're outside. And so even they're now asking the question about representation. These things that we think are benign, like if we don't see an image or a picture or a story. But that tells everything. Its sense of it being benign is why it has so much power. And who do we relate to? The idea that if I see someone who looks like you, I actually believe I can relate to it because we're human beings. But it may not work the other way because we're not used to considering that you might have something in common with me too, even though I look entirely different from you. But if we had that kind of conversation, what if we were really bold at telling different stories and not filling them in the blanks so that we just make sure we add one at the end in the picture? I don't mean it like that. I mean that person becomes the conduit for everyone to try to understand and expand how we are different and think of nature and engage with nature. Does that make sense?
It's fascinating. It's kind of a touchy question maybe, but I'm just going to throw it out there because I don't know quite what the answer is, but I write for an environmental magazine, and I don't want to name them because I'm not representing them here, but they often come to me and they say, do you know any writers of color who could give us a story? We're tired of hearing from you. And more or less is what they're saying. And, you know, and
now I know why they haven't been responding to my email.
And, you know, Colorado is known, it's a pretty white place, but I've often wondered, actually, I don't know. I mean, I'm pretty up on the community of writers, especially in the American West, who are writing about environmental issues, and I can't find any voices. Can you? And is it my problem that I don't know them, or are they not publishing? Or they?
I don't want to say that it's your problem, because that's actually because it becomes all of our problem, actually, right? So if it's more collectively, I like to think of it that way. I think one I would say is that not everyone calls himself a writer first. So there's a way, when I think about this issue of diversity more broadly, whose stories are told, there are people that come from many different angles, some because they do write about and think about nature, some because that they're activists around these issues more broadly, some because they're educators. So you can, when you start to expand, you know, for me, instead of thinking of who is a writer, but writing as a space and a way within which to share and expand how we understand the larger stories of nature and place and who we are, then the list gets wide open. And some of these people are really good. I mean, they write blogs. They write within their community. They have a voice. For me, it's also about those of us in a privileged position to make space for those different voices. And so part of that making space is expanding the criteria for what, I don't mean the quality, and people often conflate that. I just mean expanding the criteria for what it is that we might see. Because what I said earlier, just in an earlier session, I said, you know, it's hard to know what you don't know. And so, right, you know, how do we change that? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I agree, and I think they perhaps maybe need to get creative with who they're, like you were saying, elicit stories from. Somebody we were talking about who we have in common yesterday is a woman named Betty Reed Soskin, who is the oldest full-time national park ranger. Maybe you've seen her.
She's amazing.
She just turned 95 this past week, and she's a ranger at World War II, Rosie the Riveter, World War II
Richmond
National Historic Site. It has like 10 more words, but that's the bulk of it. And she has told us both, you know, in different conversations, whose story gets told is a product of who is sitting at the table.
She's African American, by the way.
Oh, yeah, no, I probably should have said that.
I kind of like that you didn't. You just kind of said, you know, she's just great.
Yeah.
But yeah.
But that is a relevant detail, so I appreciate that. But she now has, you know, hordes of fans, people who, you know, line up to attend her ranger talks, because she talks about working in a Jim Crow Union Hall, and how, you know, there were African American soldiers fighting for a freedom that they didn't actually feel, you know, when they got home, and some of the dichotomy there. So characters like that might be able to speak meaningfully, not just to people of color and tell them, you know, she told me that she always saw parks, she grew up in California, parks is something for the RV, you know, the white RV set, and that she didn't until midlife really go to her first park, and that was Yosemite, but she now truly feels that they are a place for her, and that she tries to communicate with everybody who she speaks to at the park, especially young African American women. She pointed out that this is your story too, but she said you can look around at any face in the room and somebody can find part of their story there. So maybe more creativity in the characters we look for.
Yeah, people like John Francis. I mean, how many people in this room know who John Francis is? And when I tell you, yeah, I love you in the back. John Francis, African-American man, spent 22 years walking across the U.S. and Latin America to raise environmental awareness, and he did it for 17 years without talking. And his story, Planet Walker, I mean, Hollywood brought the rights to the story. I mean, he's written a book about it, and he couldn't get anybody to publish it. So he had to self-publish the story because there's so many stories about African-American men walking across the country for 22 years to raise environmental awareness.
They're all over.
Oh, man, I know. And eventually National Geographic did republish it. Or Shelton Johnson, who's the famous black park ranger at Yosemite, who brought the story of Buffalo soldiers to life. He wrote a book called Gloryland. I mean, there are just so many for me, there's so many people out there. Eddie Harris canoed the length of the Mississippi River when he was 30 years old, and he's written a number of books about that experience. And he said he has gone to publishers where he tries to come in nature writing, but they don't see his writing as nature writing. I don't know about that. Canoeing the length of the Mississippi and talking about your experience of what that's like to ride an iconic American river, I don't know, kind of fits into nature, but that was me being sarcastic. Sorry.
Is there a reason they don't consider that nature writing? Is there kind of a trope of like we need to notice the fungus on a tree or worry about the future of nature in order for it to be nature writing? You know, are there different ways of that nature writing has been defined by a particular representation of what nature, you know, what nature is and how we're supposed to protect it. And
I think, frankly, we don't think that minorities know what the value of the outdoors is. I mean, there's so many, I'm not one of them, but there's so many ways that the state that we're in now in relevancy in terms of parks reflects what it was 100 years ago. The founders 100 years ago had the same problem with how are we going to get money to support parks. We need to make them relevant to all people. So the media stepped in, industry stepped in to help fill that void. And maybe we need to look at Outside Magazine or whoever are the vendors that advertise in it, you know, industry to start reflecting the state of affairs, which is there are, you know, outdoor writers who are minorities and, you know, they have meaningful experiences, and we need to look to the media to do that job better as well.
You have a great writer right here in the state of Colorado, African-American writer Camille Dungey, who wrote 400 Years of Black Nature Writing, and the book's like that fat. And to really understand that, she took a lot of famous poets that a lot of us have heard, Langston Hughes, and others that are not that well known. But it's even to understand what is nature writing, because for me, she's pushing back on this idea. And it's not to diminish those who write in a more traditional way about that. But that's not how we all see and experience it. You know, when I think about John Muir's 1,000-Mile Walk Through the Gulf that he wrote in 1867, which is really just a memoir, not just, I don't want to diminish it, it was what it was a memoir of his time, walking across certain states in the South to get a feeling of what happened, what happens when war takes place, what happens to the environment place. You know, he was telling a lot of his truths, but he also said some pretty nasty things about black people and Native people. Like if you read it, it's in his own words, you know, which for me reveals the complexity that you can have somebody with a really great idea and a really good intention towards a piece of our society, but not really have a full understanding of the rest of that. Yeah.
He redeems himself a little bit later when he travels to Alaska and he spends a lot of time with Native American.
I imagine I've written a piece where I'd love to, you know, like I pretended I'm in conversation with John Muir because I sit on the National Parks Advisory Board. Because people have asked me with an expectation, is John Muir still relevant? And I lived in California for 8 years, and you know, you can't say John Muir, you better be careful about how you say John Muir, right, in the state of California. And they think what I'm going to say is that he's not relevant, and that's absolutely not what I would say. I would say, though, I said, you know, I wonder if I'd be relevant to John Muir. And really, John Muir becomes relevant on my own terms, in terms of I can only understand John Muir based on my own life and my own experience. It becomes a much more expansive experience. It's not one or the other. His view is not the only view. I'm not interested in diminishing whatever commitment and brilliance that he has brought to the table. And it was flawed. And I would argue that most people are flawed because we live in a country that is highly flawed. Doesn't make it bad, just makes it flawed, right? And so for me, it's like, how do we keep it real in that moment so then we can think about how we move forward collectively?
Well, exactly. That's what I want to ask. We are flawed. We are flawed. And if you were president or head of, well, God or the universe or of the National Park Service, yes, what would you do? I mean, what future could we head towards?
What would you do?
The Jumbotron in Times Square comes to mind for some reason. I would do something with the Jumbotron.
That's a good idea.
I'm working on it. It's a work in progress.
I would declare a lot more lands public. If I get to be God, I'm just, you know, I'm having fun here. What, you know, think big.
about 5 or 6 years ago, President Clinton came to Berkeley and just gave a big talk about everything. And I'd never seen him speak in person. And regardless of what you think of his politics, the man was a hell of an orator. He didn't even have any notes. And he talked about everything from Haiti to the state of education. But the quote that stuck with me is that he said, you know, if you look at developing countries, their biggest challenge is always going to be infrastructure and the need to build up that infrastructure. He said, but if you look at countries like the US, our biggest problem is the rigidity of our institutions. And that really, you know, the idea, whether it's our public lands institutions, our academic institutions, that we get very caught up, in my opinion, in sort of the tradition of the way that we have done things, our mission statements, our resistance, thinking that if we lose that, we somehow lose the set of values that we've built our own self upon, instead of understanding that, for me, all those things are fluid, which doesn't make us any less committed, but who lost because of your values? Because your values got privileged. Who loses because of that? And if we were thinking more collectively in relationship, I really am so interested in relationships of reciprocity that I start to understand that my well-being is dependent upon your well-being. If I understand that, then my values can kind of expand to encompass that. I believe we have the capacity for it, but the resistance to that, and that we have to change all of our institutions. I think our institutions are just from like 100 years ago, including the academic ones, including our political ones. They're just dinosaurs. And it doesn't mean we throw them out like the baby out with the bathwater, that there isn't some value there. But they're not serving us in our best way right now. So if I was king of the world, I'd be like, how do we just remake all those institutions, the rules, how we evaluate what has value, what counts, what does promotion look like? How are we thinking more about whole communities as opposed to separate communities? The black community, the white community, the Asian community. What would it look like if we actually considered the idea of a whole community? That I can see myself in everyone, and I need everyone to be moving forward in order for myself to move forward. That's what I would do. Vote for me!
You can use my Jumbotron to do that.
Yes, thank you. I like the Jumbotron idea.
Did you have any other ideas besides the Jumbotron? It looked like you were about to say something. That's all.
It's been an odd week, I guess, but I'm generally very optimistic about. No, I'm not actually. I'm generally I'm an optimistic person, but I kind of lean towards pessimism in terms of ecology and the environment. And so I don't often get to hold that magic wand, but I don't allow myself to, because I want to work out practical solutions to the problem. But in terms of the question of relevancy, I would like to try to communicate to people that parks they were founded on a democratic ideal, is the way that Roosevelt put it, even though the conservation idea predates him, you know, with Hudson River Valley painters and poets among them, you know, many brilliant African Americans, and I would tell them that that's your story too. And
it's relevant to all of us.
Yeah, and I'm trying to understand better. I start with the story about how I came into parks, because I have a certain experience with approaching a national park. For example, still, I drive up to the gate of a national park. I'm excited. I know, you know, paradise lies on the other side, unless you're talking about Yellowstone in the centennial year, and then it's just like millions of people lie on the other side. But in general, you cross over and you know when you're in a park. And I'm excited when I see rangers, you know, even now in my 40s, because of, you know, that magic in those stories and that immense institutional knowledge. But I'm beginning to understand that that is not everybody's experience. You know, a gate means different things to different people. Somebody in a uniform, you know, means a different thing to other people. And how to try to get inside that and remake, you know, some of those institutional things that I love, but in a way that is more welcoming to people who did not have the same experience that I do. So I'm absolutely with you.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. Thank you. I'd like to open it up to the audience. We can talk about buffalo or bears or national parks, and we'll. We're going to pass around a mic so that people in the back can hear.
Yes, the statement that my well-being depends on your well-being might very well apply to all of humanity and all of life forms. Given that there's little hope from the corporate or political class to change that perception, where can we look for help on that? It seems so, in one sense, common sense that we seem to be denying.
I would say we look to ourselves, right? I mean, so I always, as a geographer, I think on scale, about issues of scale. So when you say the corporate entities, yes, those entities, which are made up of people who are part of communities, and so are we. So I really, maybe I'm way too much of an optimist and an idealist, but the only thing that I can do, I actually can't make you do anything. The only thing I can do is look at the choices that I make, right? That's really the only thing I have any control over, and I don't even have control over what those choices are. But at every moment, I can always make a different choice. So something for me, I want to believe in that. The minute I lose that, then it's over, then I'm done. So I really believe that if we look to ourselves, there's the possibility. There's always the possibility. Yeah. Oh, okay.
Thank you for this topic. It's really timely and really fascinating for me. Is that working? Okay. Could you talk a little bit about the urban population versus perhaps rural or suburban and their experience with the wild and how the wild is promoted on TV and the internet as maybe a scary or dangerous place? And how that affects people's participation in national parks.
I can say something, but I want to take up all this. You want me to go?
Well, may I just say first that I introduced the book. I'm also from New York. Grew up right outside of New York City, and had not been to the Statue of Liberty even on a school trip for some reason. Only went for the first time the year before last. But very close to that in Lower Manhattan is a tiny national park unit called the African American Burial Ground. And I start the book with that and kind of use New York as an example of the wide diversity of the types of parks that are under the control of the National Park Service. That's a park that I feel like if we're going to talk about getting kids or talking about getting adults to parks, if most of people live in urban centers, that's the type of gateway, we could possibly use to introduce the idea of national park units and the idea of what rangers do and the types of stories that the National Park Service tells. It's a microcosm of, it's a tiny but green space in right off of Wall Street, strange enough, but it is hugely impactful in the space that, in the stories that it tells. So I think I'd like to look at urban areas more in terms of gateways that are kind of underutilized at this point in time.
One of the things I say, I love the cities. I'm from city, I love the city, and one of the challenges for me in conversations with some folks around environment and nature is somehow the urban area doesn't have any nature. And it's like I wrote a piece about this. I'm sorry, that's where I learned about nature, because nature is everywhere. Again, are you breathing? If you are, guess what? You have a relationship with nature. And so that dichotomy actually doesn't serve us either. That for me, that somehow if you live in an urban area, you have already some kind of nature deficit disorder. You may have some nature deficit, but it's not because you live in a city that you have it, right? In my humble opinion. And also thinking about what is wild. I also like to tell a story about people connect, and you said it because I visited the African American burial grounds and ways that people can connect. Not everybody, it's not always about going on a hike, right? I mean, it's beautiful for some people, and that's how some people get it, and some people get that connection by camping, but it's not the only way to do it. In 2005, I was living in Atlanta for a year, and my parents came to visit me, so I took them to Martin Luther King National Park. And my father is just really old school, hardcore. He really didn't want to go. He has a lot of anger about this country and about his own life in it, so anything around national parks for him is not very interesting. But I said, come on, you'll go, you're going to love it. We go to Martin Luther King National Park is right in downtown Atlanta. People live on that street. There's Ebenezer Baptist Church, the house where Dr. King grew up in, and a visitor center. And at the time, the visitor center had diorama. And so when you walk into the visitor center, the sights and sounds, it was supposed to be like, this is what the 50s and 60s looks like. There's images, there's sounds of people protesting and Dr. King's voice over the loudspeaker. There's life-size statues of people marching. There's a replica of Dr. King's jail cell. You are just inundated. So I'm standing with my dad in front of some of these images, and my dad doesn't easily show any kind of vulnerability or anything like that. And he suddenly grabs my arm, and he had completely blanched. And so what I thought had happened was that he was having a heart attack. Because the only way he's grabbing my arm was like if I was a kid and had done something wrong, right? And then right after that, he giggled, which was even weirder, right? And I said, Dad, what's wrong? And he pointed to an image. And the image was of a sign. It said, "White for whites only." He pointed to that sign. He said, I saw that sign, and for a moment, I thought we weren't supposed to be here. It had taken him back 40 years that fast. He was grabbing my arm to say, we need to get out. But then he caught himself because he said, oh my God, he got really embarrassed about it. I usually tell that story and I kind of leave it like that to talk about the power of memory. But really, at the end of the day, we all went out to eat. My father couldn't stop talking about what a great time that he had because he connected. It was a hard and difficult memory. It was a challenging moment for him, but he connected emotionally, and suddenly he felt part of the story. And there's something really powerful about some of our more difficult stories that we're often afraid to tell, but actually it gives an opportunity for people to, at our sort of deepest place in terms of our empathy, our heart, down there to really feel seen. So I think, telling more of those stories, the whole story around how the African burial ground came about even, because people were just throwing out bodies when they didn't come in. There's even a story about how that story came to be in that place. I think if we take more of those opportunities, we can start to open up doors, not just for those who are in urban places, but for those everywhere.
Yeah, and there's that. Oh, sorry to interrupt.
Okay.
There's that symbol called the Sankofa, which is dominant, the African-American burial ground, and it's, I think, West Africa. I forget which country exactly it comes from. But it's that idea of looking back to look forward, and I think we really need to give that careful consideration.
Thank you. I thought I might add a little bit to answer your question. I grew up on a ranch in northern Colorado, and I spent most of my life outdoors. 80% of my time was outdoors, and I always considered the outdoors a much safer place than a city. I was just way more comfortable. And on our first writing residency I was at in Wyoming, I was the only Coloradoan there, and everyone else was from New York. And they kept asking me things like, do you have to wear big boots for the rattlesnakes? And I was like, well, rattlesnakes don't go leaping out at you. You have to walk into them. And so, boots are a good idea. But I realized then, and we all know this, that sometimes the fear of the wild comes from, it's just unknown to you. And so it was for that reason that I wrote a book about Colorado's bears, because a great hero of mine was Enos Mills, who started Rocky Mountain National Park, and he had been a Quaker and fighting to protect grizzly bears. And he kept trying to convince the American public that the zeitgeist of the grizzly bear as a man-eating, horrible creature, and all the pictures in the newspaper showed him with big teeth with devilly looking eyes, that was just wrong. They mostly ate grubs and moths and berries and, but they could be dangerous. He wasn't a fool, but he was just trying to change the zeitgeist. And although Colorado now has no grizzlies, they're extinct since 1979, people are still so afraid of bears. And so part of my book is, in all of the state of Colorado, since we've been taking records, 3 people have died from bears, black bears. 2 of them were feeding bears and offering food, and 1 was a camper at Rocky Mountain National Park, and the bear who attacked him was necropsied later, and that bear had one of those kid buckets in its stomach. So no bear has ever killed, no healthy bear that wasn't being fed has ever killed a Coloradoan since we've been keeping records. So, you tell that to some people and they're like, oh, I guess I'll go camping after all. I'm like, yeah, really, there's things to be careful of, but I feel much safer out there than I do in Denver. Because traffic, I just feel like a car's going to run into me at any moment. But I just feel like the idea of wild is often, directly correlated to knowledge. And the more we understand about the natural world, the less we fear it. But also, if there is something to fear in it, because I'm not a moron, there are, but we know how to deal with those dangers in an intelligent way. So, okay, there's a question.
Thank you. I have a question for Ms. Finney. I really appreciated your thoughts about how you're trying to change the system or impact the system from being an advisor on the National Park Service Board. I'm a really big supporter of National Park. I go to a new national park every year for the last 20 years. So I didn't know that there were 413 institutions. Probably will,
you better live to be
I probably will
400
never
then.
cover that. And I go and camp in the park so that just going inside and coming back in the dates doesn't count that being there in my book. And I do not come across a lot of diverse people. And I'm an immigrant myself, so, and my father still lives in India, so I really didn't have anybody who would say, hey, there's awesome ads of go RVing and fishing and stuff like that. I had to learn everything by myself. Ms. Finney, how are you impacting the community from the inside? Are you doing anything about that? In my travels, in my camping, I don't come across diverse people, and probably you can represent a little bit on the African American side of it, not really Hispanic, that I don't see any African American families camping, bringing their children, or the national parks. And I understand that Colorado is very homogeneous. You go to REI, you go to, Rocky Mountain National Park, you won't see a lot of African American people, but in other states where there are many of them, you still don't see, and National Park Service is quite affordable. There are a lot of free days throughout the year, and you don't see them. Are you doing anything to impart the importance of outdoors and visiting national park in the community?
Let me answer it this way. There are a lot of people who are doing something about it. Now I'm, a voice among many. First, it's really hard for me to make a blanket assessment of all the parks because of the different geographies and the challenges. So I lived in Florida for a year because when I was working on this, you've got Everglades National Park, Biscayne National Park, and Big Cypress National Preserve. And Everglades is an hour from Miami. And they were also having this problem. You have a large Latino population and African American population, weren't getting a lot of people there. And for them, it was really basic. Not everybody can afford to own a car, and there was no public transportation. So it didn't matter how cheap or free the park was, they couldn't get there in the first place, right? So some of it is really fundamental to how the community is set up and the assumptions that are made about who can afford basic things like transportation and access. Some of it is going to have to do with, you brought it up before, I've heard this particularly from friends of mine who are Latino, the idea of seeing the uniform. The uniform is threatening to some and others, and some of it is not understanding what it means if you go to big places like Yosemite. My parents, we never went to a national park. I didn't go to a national park till I was sometime in my 30s. I had already been living in Nepal and still hadn't gone to a national park in the United States. Sometimes people don't even know they're in a national park. So Cuyahoga National Park in Ohio is right in the middle of the city, and it actually overlaps with state and local parks. And actually, you've got all kinds of diverse people hanging out in it, but they don't know they're even in a national park, right? So, there's 12 national parks in Washington, D.C. alone because the White House is a national park. I mean, so it really is it's also how we count and what we see. And for some, I just think it's also not in their experience. There's a long history of, I asked when I was interviewing a lot of African Americans about what do they think about the environment, what do they think about national parks, the sense if it's an old boys club. I mean, there's a lot of this, Dudley Do-Right ideas of, who the rangers are, who they see. And culturally speaking, it may not be in every family's purview to think about that's what we do for vacation. But it doesn't mean that they don't care about non-human nature in the outdoors, and it doesn't mean they don't have a relationship. One of the things I used to say to people in Florida, they'd be like, well, there's no brown and black people come down to Biscayne or coming down to the Everglades, so therefore, you know, they're just not engaged with nature. But meanwhile, if you just drive around South Florida, you can see brown people fishing every single day on the canals. But it's like nobody notices that. It's really weird, but you can see them because they're out every day. They're fishing every day. That's an engagement with nature, but it's not counted. So it's also, you know, what do people like to do? And I can tell you some not nice stories of people's experiences of going to park spaces and not feeling welcome either. That happens. Parks are beautiful, but people are people. So that's also real.
Yeah, I know we're out of time. I just wanted to ask, how did you find your way to parks?